Welcome back, guys. Our video today is going to cover section 6 out of chapter 37. It's a little bit short in terms of content, but I am going to talk a little bit about a disease today, and then tomorrow we'll get into thoughts on COVID. Okay, so 37.6, it's going to be about how does the adaptive immune system respond and remember its past victories, so things that it's actually beaten before. So what happens after you get an infection? Originally, those plasma cells that were releasing antibodies and cytotoxic T cells, the ones that were fighting off that particular disease, they only live a few days, so they die off. So it's not like you just have these things sitting around forever. However, some of the daughter cells of those original B cells, cytotoxic T cells, and helper T cells that responded to the initial infection differentiate into memory B cells and memory T cells that live for many years. Okay, so if the body's invaded again by the same invader, these cells right here recognize the invader and begin the immune response. So they start dividing again, building up a response to that particular invader. So memory B cells rapidly produce a clone of plasma cells. Plasma cells are going to secrete the antibodies that combat the second infection. Memory T cells produce clones of helper T cells and cytotoxic T cells that are also specific for the remembered invader, the thing that's come back. This response is often fast enough that you experience no symptoms. So this is what happens when you become immune to something. It happens so quickly, it ramps up production very, very fast, and you're immune to experiencing the symptoms of that particular virus, disease, or bacteria of some kind. Okay, so what does this look like, in terms of how quickly things respond? So our y-axis here is the immune response, how much antibody is being produced. So this is the first time you would get a particular pathogen and the response. So it's slow because there's only maybe one or two cells that are able to initiate that response. Okay, you slowly build up, it fights it off, right? And you build up antibodies, memory B cells, memory T cells, to that particular type of infection. All right, so then there's some gap of time between the first time you got the disease and the second time you get the disease. So the second time you get it, your immune system is going to ramp up production much more quickly. Okay, as soon as you get exposed to it a second time, it knows immediately, hey, let's go get this thing. So it's going to respond much faster than it did the first time because those memory cells are going to initiate a response much quicker. So this is what we call acquired immunity. It gives long-lasting protection against many diseases: smallpox, measles, mumps, chickenpox, rubella. A lot of this stuff comes as vaccines that you get basically as an infant, so that if for whatever reason you were to encounter it out there in the wild, you would not come down with it. It's pretty rare to get these things. Okay, chickenpox maybe not, but the other ones, it's pretty rare to get those three simply because we have vaccines against it, and it's hard to spread if most people aren't going to get sick with it. Unless, of course, you didn't get those vaccines as a child for some reason, whether your parents chose not to or whether you might have like an immuno disease of some kind that prevented you from getting these, so then you just have to be a little bit careful. But thankfully, everybody else being vaccinated against it does protect you. Okay, and by the way, while we're here, there is no correlation between vaccinations and autism at all. All of that data is basically been falsified. It's proven not to be true, so don't fall for that anti-vax stuff. At least in terms of that, is definitely not true. So acquired immunity can fail, though. All right, and reasons being is mostly because diseases can mutate rapidly and produce new antigens that the memory cells do not recognize. This is why you get different colds every single flu season. You don't get the exact same virus every single year. You get some sort of variation of it, and depending on how close it matches to ones that you've had in the past, your body may or may not be able to respond fast enough to fight that off. So diseases mutate, which kind of slows down your response to it. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about Ebola, and then tomorrow I'll get into kind of the scientific perspective and maybe a couple of my thoughts on the coronavirus we're dealing with now, and kind of comparing the two and understanding why this one that we're dealing with today is very different than Ebola that we've known about for a little while here. But anyway, so here's a picture of what the Ebola virus actually looks like. It's kind of a long, narrow, tube-looking virus. That's what it actually does look like. This avian flu virus I think it's a type of coronavirus as well, because these coronaviruses get these sort of surface markers that look like a crown, but we're not going to talk about avian flu virus. I'll get into a different coronavirus, right? COVID-19, the one we're dealing with right now. Anyways, Ebola. Actually, the first case was 1976. And back then, about 70% of people that were infected with it died. That's an insanely high lethality here. Only 602 total died, which tells you there really weren't that many cases of it, because people very quickly realized that if you are infected, if you're showing symptoms of Ebola, you don't have a good chance of making it through. So they kind of isolated you and kind of left you for dead, which is kind of unfortunate, but that's the way that they dealt with it to prevent the disease from spreading. And there have been kind of pop-ups of Ebola now and then since 1976, but you might remember 5 or 6 years ago, there was another outbreak of Ebola. And this time around, we have tens of thousands of people die. The fatality rate was a little bit smaller, only because medicine's a little bit better. We've known about this for a while. We know what the disease looks like. We know how to treat it. We know the healthcare precautions to take so that those who are dealing with people that are sick also don't get infected. So, but we still had tens of thousands of people die, okay? We did manage to kind of contain it, though. It didn't really get far out of Africa. There were a few, I think a couple of Americans that had it from travel and being exposed to it. But it was shut down pretty quickly, and we'll talk about why. But anyways, let's talk about what Ebola actually does first. So why is it so deadly? Well, one of the major problems is that it evades the immune system response. Your body doesn't necessarily immediately recognize it as an invader. And then secondly, it goes after your organs, vital organs, the important ones. So that's kind of problematic. So how does it avoid detection? Normally, a human cell infected with the virus releases interferon, okay, which is a protein that increases the resistance of not yet infected cells nearby. So a human cell that's gotten infected by a virus releases interferon, telling other cells, hey, be ready for this. Well, Ebola prevents the release of interferon. So the nearby cells have no idea that other cells nearby are getting infected. Usually, virus-infected cells display viral antigens to macrophages and dendritic cells, which begin the adaptive immune response. Well, the problem here is that Ebola bypasses this whole system by infecting macrophages and dendritic cells directly. So not only does it affect, some of your normal cells, but it goes straight after the immune system cells, macrophages and dendritic cells. Okay, that's kind of problematic, and it hijacks them to make new Ebola viruses instead. So the cells that would have been responsible for destroying and killing Ebola-infected cells are themselves infected. These new viruses infect B and C cells, further killing the adaptive immune response. So this thing goes right after the immune system, and basically shuts it down, kills all the cells that are designed to kill it. As if that weren't already enough, Ebola virus then targets cells that form the lining of blood vessels, causing them to leak. If you've heard about what Ebola does, people that die from it, basically they're bleeding out of every orifice of their body, and then they have lesions in their skin that they're profusely bleeding, and they can't stop it. So the Ebola virus targets cells in your blood vessels, causing them to leak blood. It also shuts down clotting factors, so not only does it kill the cells in your blood vessels, but it also prevents your blood from clotting, which is problematic because then it just keeps leaking right out of the blood vessels. And this is actually what ends up really finally killing people, is when your body finally does have the ability to respond, it ends up being so strong that it kills the person. The immune response, when it's able to do it, actually kills you. The weakened person releases so many cytokines at once. Once everything finally catches up. And remember, cytokines are going to help soften up tissue. Well, and basically creates a body-wide inflammatory response. So it's not just a localized thing. Imagine your entire body going through inflammation all at once. The blood vessels become so leaky that the victim bleeds internally and externally. So your own immune system gets hijacked by Ebola, and then after that, when it does finally start working, it basically puts your whole body into an inflammatory response. You get severe vomiting and diarrhea, and then Ebola virus is basically in every bodily fluid, and the problem is if you make contact with it, you have a huge likelihood of contracting the disease. So why did this thing slow down? How are we able to stop it? Well, one, our medicine got a little bit better. It's still not like a vaccine for Ebola. But part of it is that it is so darn lethal. When it kills people at the rate that it does, I mean, we're talking like at minimum 40% of people that get sick with it end up dying with it, it doesn't really have as much of a chance to spread. Which we'll see is kind of the problem with COVID-19, is that it's not quite as lethal. Here we know that, hey, if you get this, your odds of surviving are not good. And so we try to treat these with the best precautions we can, but ultimately, like, these people are quarantined from the rest of society to make sure that they do not infect other people. And so that's kind of how we were able to stop this thing, is because it was so lethal. We knew to stay away from it. We were able to contain it. We were able to track it. And so it's kind of slowed it down to the point where if it's going to pop up again, we know exactly how to deal with it. We're going to see that COVID-19 has got the opposite problem, where it's lethal enough that it's dangerous, but not so lethal that it can't spread. So we'll talk about that tomorrow.